Okay, so you're halfway through the course. So far, we've introduced you to the global industrial food system. We marveled at its ability to feed the world, but we also worried about some of the unintended consequences, the externalities, the injustices. We then went on to discuss some of the big questions about animals in particular, about how we farm, kill, and consume them, and in the process introduced you to 3 of our 4 main ethical frameworks. We had the utilitarian theory, the Kantian theory, and the divine command theory. We pointed out that each of these 3 frameworks could be used to motivate different responses to the animal question. One response is just to try to improve the industrial animal agriculture food system. Another is to try to find a totally alternative way to raise and produce animals, maybe more humane, more sustainable. Or we could just reject animal agriculture and go vegan or vegetarian or freegan or roadkillitarian and so forth. In this section of the course, we turn away from issues related to the eating of non-human animals and try to focus instead on some important empirical and ethical issues related to us, the eaters, the human animals. We start with a food activist from Chicago, LaDonna Redmond, who introduces us to specifically urban concerns about food access in Chicago, but then also to some larger food justice issues that face the continent as a whole. Will then introduces us to the concept of a food desert. This is supposed to be an area, typically in a large city, where there's insufficient access to healthy, affordable food. That lecture prefaces your own inquiry into food security issues in the US. We also take a survey about your ways of accessing food. We ask you to look at some facts and figures related to diet-related disease like obesity and diabetes, and the extent to which they affect particular populations more than others. Vegan soul food chef and author Bryant Terry then comes and talks to us about some of these issues: access, education, nutrition, also talks about how these things relate to race. We then consider some interesting statistics regarding diet-related disease and how that looks across different demographics. Finish up the empirical study then with a debate between Cornell nutritionists and food scientists. Famous nutritionist T. Colin Campbell comes and plumps for his conclusion that a plant-based diet allows us to avoid what he calls diseases of affluence, cancer, heart disease. Campbell's research in the China study has influenced a lot of people, including Bill Clinton actually, to become more or less vegan, but it's not without its vocal critics in both nutrition science and the food industry. Here we'll have our friend food scientist Joe Regenstein and Cornell nutritionist David Levitsky speak for those critics, and then we'll have Campbell respond. With the empirical information under our belts, we can then turn more directly to some of the ethical issues. So you want to ask questions like, do governments or corporations have a responsibility to try to eradicate food deserts? Do corporations generally have a responsibility to the commons, to social justice as it relates to food? Or are they ultimately just beholden to their stockholders? If corporations shouldn't or won't be involved, then what can we as individuals do? In this context, we'll hear Ron Finley give a TED Talk describing his own efforts to grow what he calls a food forest in an LA parkway, how the government initially responded, and then how his so-called guerrilla gardening movement took off. Then we'll hear from a local Tompkins County Ithaca community activist, Jamila Sakiera, about how nutrition education occurs in underprivileged areas right here in Tompkins County. At the end of the course, we'll return to food politics issues, but here we do want to dip into that a bit by discussing the way in which, in the US anyway, so-called food guidelines are written, negotiated, lobbied, protested, and ultimately distributed. We'll also hear about why we moved from a food guide initially to a food pyramid with a little guy walking up the side of it, and ultimately now to a food plate. The final part of the lineup has to do not with consumers, but with workers. These are the people who are often neglected in discussions of food justice, as well as in food ethics generally. We think about animals, we think about the environment, we think about health, but we forget this huge group of millions of people who work to grow, harvest, and bring us our food, sometimes under slave labor conditions. Here we'll interview the director of Cornell's farm worker program, Mary Jo Dudley, and then take a trip with her to a farm just miles from Ithaca in which migrant workers are employed in some difficult circumstances. We got to talk to one of those workers and even film some of the conversation, though as you'll see, we have to use some camera tricks to protect his profile and identity. I think this is one of the most interesting videos in the whole course. We conclude this section by turning back again to us, our role as consumers. Given what we now know about how the food that we eat is produced, what should or can we do? Where should we purchase our food? Should we all start our own backyard gardens or urban agriculture? Do we have to scrutinize every label and vet every recipe and inspect every farm that we buy from? If not, what can we do as individuals to try to help promote a healthy, well-fed, and just society? These are some of the issues we'll consider here in week 4.